The stagecoach rolled into Caldwell, Kansas on a Thursday afternoon in the late summer of 1879, caked in red dust and trailing the kind of weariness that only comes from a journey that has asked too much of a person. And when Eva Morgan stepped down onto the packed earth of the main street, she was holding a sleeping infant against her chest with one arm and clutching a battered carpetbag with the other. Her dark hair loose from its pins and her green eyes carrying the particular hollow look of a woman who has survived something she never expected to survive. Nobody came to meet her. That was the first thing people noticed, those few who happened to be standing outside Greer's General Store or leaning against the post of the telegraph office when the stage came in. A young woman, clearly not yet 25, arriving alone with a baby and no husband stepping down behind her, no family waiting with open arms, no familiar face brightening at the sight of her. Just Eva Morgan planting her boots on the soil of a town she had never been to before, squinting into the afternoon sun with the kind of determined, set to her jaw that said she had already made peace with whatever came next. She had written one letter 3 weeks prior to a name she had found posted on a board at the land office in Wichita. The notice had been brief and practical, as most things in the West were. Needed one housekeeper and cook for a working cattle ranch outside Caldwell. Capable woman preferred. Room and board provided. Inquire to Oliver Keating, Keating Ranch, Sumner County. She had written back with equal brevity, stating only her name, her age 23, her experience keeping house, her willingness to work hard, and the single admission that she would be traveling with a young child. She had not explained whose child it was. She had not felt that explanation was owed to a stranger. The reply had come back in a firm, economical hand. Come if you can be here by the 22nd. The work is real and the days are long. You will have your own room. Oh, Keating. She had arrived on the 22nd, and she stood now on the main street of Caldwell with the baby stirring against her shoulder and wondered, not for the first time, whether she had made a terrible mistake. The town of Caldwell in 1879 was no quiet frontier hamlet. It sat at the edge of the Kisham Trail and fancied itself a proper cattle town, loud and dusty, and full of the kind of men who had driven longhorns up from Texas and intended to spend their earnings before the week was out. The saloons were busy even in the afternoon. Horses lined the hitching rails 3 deep outside the Lone Star. A group of cowboys in trail-worn clothes were arguing amicably outside the livery stable, and the smell of cattle and wood smoke and frying meat hung over everything like a warm, complicated blanket. Eva shifted the baby to her other arm and walked toward the general store, because it was the only sensible place to start. The man behind the counter was broad and gray-whiskered, with the appraising eyes of someone who had seen every manner of person pass through a boomtown, and had formed an opinion of most of them within the first 30 seconds. "I'm looking for the Keating Ranch," Eva said, setting her carpetbag down on the floor and adjusting the baby, who had woken now and was regarding the ceiling of the store with the wide, philosophical calm of an infant utterly unbothered by the chaos of the adult world. "Can you tell me how to find it?" The man studied her for a moment, then the baby, then her again. "Oliver Keating's place." "Yes, sir. About 4 miles north of town. Follow the main road till you see the creek crossing, then take the left fork. His gates marked with a K brand on the post." He paused. "You the housekeeper he was expecting?" "I am." The man's expression did not change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "He's a good man, Oliver Keating. Works hard, keeps to himself mostly." Another pause. "Doesn't say much, but he means what he says." Eva nodded, and though she hadn't asked for an endorsement, she found herself grateful for it. "Is there someone who might take me out there? A wagon, perhaps?" "Hank Greer," a voice said from somewhere among the shelves, and a younger man appeared from behind a stack of flour sacks, wiping his hands on his pants and grinning. He looked about 19, lanky and amiable. "That's my pa behind the counter. I'm Hank. I make runs out that direction near every other day." I can take you out soon as I hitch the mule if you want." "I would be very grateful," Eva said, and meant it completely. She sat on the bench seat of Hank's wagon with the baby in her lap, the carpet bag tucked behind her feet, and watched the flat Kansas grassland spread itself out in every direction under a sky that was almost violent in its blueness. She had grown up in Missouri, in a town with trees and creeks, and the particular kind of small-town density that comes from people living too close together for too long, and the openness of the Kansas plains still startled her in a way she couldn't quite get accustomed to. It made her feel exposed. It also made her feel in some way she could not precisely name, like she might actually be able to breathe. "What's the baby's name?" Hank asked, because he was the kind of young man who asked everything he was curious about. "Clara," Eva said. "She's 4 months old. She's real quiet. She wasn't always." Eva looked down at the baby, who was watching the passing grass with those enormous, serious eyes. "She cried for the first 6 weeks like she was personally offended by the world." Hank laughed. "What changed?" "She figured out the world wasn't going anywhere," Eva said, and then she smiled at her own joke, which surprised her a little. She hadn't smiled at much lately. The Keating ranch appeared first as a line of cottonwood trees along a low ridge, then as a fence line running clean and straight, then as the peaked roof of a barn and the lower, solid shape of a house. It was not a grand house by any measure, but it had been built with intention. Stone foundation, timber walls, a covered porch that ran the full length of the front. The yard was clean. The barn was in good repair. The fence posts were set level, which told Eva something about the man who lived here, because fence posts set level meant someone had taken the time to do it right when a crooked post would have served just as well functionally. There was a man near the corral, working with a horse, and Hank pulled the wagon up and called out to him. Oliver Keating came across the yard in long, unhurried strides that nonetheless covered the ground quickly. He was tall, several inches over 6 feet, and had the lean, capable build of a man who spent his days in physical labor, broad through the shoulders, narrow in the waist, with the particular kind of quietness about him that isn't shyness but something more deliberate, like a man who has learned that most things worth knowing can be learned by watching rather than speaking. He was perhaps 28 or 29, with a strong jaw and dark brown hair that curled slightly at his collar from the heat and exertion, and eyes the color of good river water, somewhere between blue and gray, that assessed the world with frank, steady attention. He looked at Eva. He looked at the baby. He did not look away from either. "Miss Morgan," he said. His voice was deeper than she'd expected, unhurried, slightly rough. "Mr. Keating," she said, "I hope I'm not later than you needed." "You're exactly when you said you'd be," he said, and reached up to help her down from the wagon. His hands were large and steadying. He took her carpet bag without being asked and handed Hank a coin for his trouble, and then he was walking toward the house, and Eva was following him, and it was as simple and as ordinary as that. The inside of the house was clean in the way that a man's house is clean when he is tidy by nature, but has no talent for the kind of domestic order that makes a place feel lived in. The main room held a table, 4 chairs, a stone fireplace with a solid iron stove beside it, a bookshelf with perhaps a dozen volumes, and a window that looked out toward the barn. The kitchen was off the back. There were 2 bedrooms down a short hallway. He showed her the second one, a small room with a wood-framed bed, a chest of drawers, and a window that looked east. "I put a crate in here," he said, gesturing to the wooden box against the far wall, lined with folded blankets. "Thought it might do for the baby to sleep in, at least until you worked out a better arrangement." Eva looked at the crate. It was exactly the right size. The blankets inside were clean and soft. She did not know why that particular detail, that simple, quiet act of practical forethought, hit her as hard as it did, but her throat closed up for just a moment and she had to press her lips together before she could speak. "That's very thoughtful," she managed. He nodded, as if it had simply been logical, and told her supper was usually around 6, and that she could find her way around the kitchen however suited her, and that there was a pump out back and a bathing room beside the kitchen, and then he went back outside and left her to it. Eva stood in that small room with Clara on her hip, and the evening light coming gold through the east window, and let out a long, slow breath. She had run away from the worst year of her life, and she had arrived at the home of a stranger who had lined a wooden crate with soft blankets without being asked, and she thought that perhaps, just perhaps, she might be all right. The first week was about learning. Eva learned the rhythm of the kitchen, where Oliver kept the flour and the dried beans and the coffee, learned that he took his coffee black and strong, and that he ate whatever she put in front of him without complaint, but that he clearly had a particular appreciation for corn bread, because the first time she made it he ate 3 pieces and said, quietly, that it was good, which she already understood was the Keating equivalent of enthusiastic praise. She learned that he was up before dawn every day, that he worked until dark, that he had 3 ranch hands, a wiry older man named Pete, a Mexican cowboy named Rodrigo who was cheerful and profoundly skilled with horses, and a young man from Georgia called Sam who was 19 and homesick and tried not to show it. She learned that Oliver paid his men fairly and on time, that he spoke to them with respect, and that they in turn worked for him with genuine loyalty rather than mere obligation. Clara, for her part, adapted to ranch life with the easy flexibility of the very young. She slept in the crate Oliver had prepared. She took to watching the ranch hands with the same solemn fascination she applied to everything else, and she had developed a particular attachment to the sound of the horses, which seemed to calm her when nothing else would. Oliver watched Clara with a careful, measured attention that Eva noticed but tried not to read too much into. He did not ask about the baby's father. He did not ask why Eva had come so far from Missouri with a 4-month-old and a single carpetbag. He did not ask anything that was not directly practical and necessary. She told herself this was simply manners, or perhaps indifference, but the more she watched him, the more she understood that it was neither of those things. It was, she came to think, a kind of deliberate respect. A man who had perhaps himself known the experience of not wanting to be asked certain questions. On the 8th day, Clara was fussing in the kitchen while Eva was trying to start supper, a sustained, unhappy cry that couldn't be soothed with rocking or the breast or walking. Eva was exhausted in the deep-boned way that mothers of young infants know, the kind of tired that sits behind your eyes and in your joints, and she was standing at the stove with tears threatening at the corners of her own eyes when Oliver came in through the back door. He stopped in the doorway, took in the scene. Without a word, he crossed to Eva, reached past her, and lifted Clara carefully from where she'd been settled against Eva's shoulder. He held the baby against his chest with a steadiness that spoke of some previous experience, though Eva couldn't imagine what, and he began to move, not rocking exactly, but a slow, rolling walk, pacing the kitchen in an even circuit, and Clara's cries tapered down to hiccups and then to silence within 2 minutes. Eva stared. Oliver looked up and met her eyes, and there was something in his expression that might have been amusement, quiet and understated. "My sister had 4, he said simply. "I used to walk them." "Your sister," Eva repeated because she realized she knew almost nothing about him. "Where is she?" "Nebraska," he said. "She married a farmer up near Platte." A pause. "I don't get up there often enough." It was the longest personal statement he had made in 8 days, and Eva tucked it away carefully. "Thank you," she said, and turned back to the stove, and listened to him pace the kitchen behind her with her daughter quiet against his chest, and felt something loosen in her that had been pulled very, very tight for a very long time. She had not planned to tell him anything. She had composed in her mind a version of herself that was simply a capable housekeeper with a baby, no history, no explanation, no weight of story dragging at her heels. But the West had a way of drawing things out of people, and Oliver Keating had a way of being quietly, steadily present that made silence feel less necessary. It was a Sunday in September, 3 weeks after her arrival. The ranch hands had the day off and had ridden into Caldwell. Clara was asleep in the crate. The prairie evening was coming on soft and golden, with a breeze that carried the distant smell of the season turning, that first whisper of autumn threaded through the warmth. Eva was sitting on the front porch with a mug of coffee, and Oliver came and sat on the porch step below her with his own mug, and they stayed that way in comfortable quiet for a while. Then Eva said her father was my husband, or was going to be. Oliver did not move or change expression, he just listened. "We were engaged," she said. "Thomas Caulfield. We'd been promised since I was 17, which was how things were done in our town. I thought I loved him. I think I thought I loved him because I'd been told I did for so long it felt like the same thing." She turned her mug in her hands. "He was not a careful man or a faithful one, but I didn't know that. Or I knew it and refused to know it, if that makes sense." "It makes sense," Oliver said. "I was with child when I found out he'd been courting another woman in the next county, a wealthier family. He married her in April." Eva's voice was steady, which had taken her a long time to achieve. "Clara was born in May. His family wanted nothing to do with either of us. My own family they were ashamed. Not unkind exactly, but the shame was louder than the kindness, and I couldn't stay there inside that shame while trying to raise a daughter, so I left." Oliver was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He doesn't know about Clara." "He knows," Eva said. "He simply doesn't care to." Another silence. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the grass. Oliver turned his coffee mug once in his large hands. "Then he's a fool," he said, and the simplicity of it, the unelaborated certainty, did something to Eva's chest that she was not prepared for. She did not cry. She had cried enough. But she nodded once and looked out at the darkening prairie, and felt for the first time since the whole terrible year had begun that someone had seen the truth of the situation clearly, and stated it plainly without hedging or moralizing or assigning her a portion of the blame. She slept well that night for the first time in a long time. October arrived and brought with it a different quality of work. The cattle drive season was winding down along the Kisham Trail, but for Oliver Keating, the autumn meant fence repairs before winter, and the laying in of supplies, and a general tightening of things against the season to come. He rode out early and came back late, and Eva found herself managing the house and Clara with an efficiency that pleased her, a sense of purpose that she hadn't realized she'd been missing. Pete, the older ranch hand, had a paternal streak a mile wide, and had taken to stopping by the kitchen in the evenings with some excuse or another. A loose buckle that needed mending, a question about whether there was more coffee, any reason to spend 15 minutes making faces at Clara, who rewarded him with the gummy, giddy laugh that Pete clearly considered the finest music in Kansas. Rodrigo brought Clara a string of painted wooden beads from town one afternoon, small enough to be harmless, bright enough to be endlessly fascinating, and hung them on the side of the crate with a solemnity that suggested he considered it a serious gift. Sam, the young Georgian, was shy around both Eva and the baby in the way that very young men are shy around women and small children, but he had begun to nod at Eva in greeting with an increasing confidence, and once, finding Clara sitting on the kitchen floor while Eva hung laundry through the back window, he had sat down cross-legged in front of her and made a tower of wooden blocks for her to knock down, and done it with an expression of such concentrated delight that Eva had to turn away to hide her smile. She was not lonely. That was the thing she kept noticing with a kind of surprised gratitude. She had expected to be lonely. It was the kind of life that could easily be lonely. A woman far from home in a working ranch house, her social world contracted to a handful of men and the flat infinity of the Kansas grassland. But she was not lonely, and she spent some time in the evenings, when Clara was asleep and the house was quiet, trying to understand why. She thought it was honesty. The people on this ranch were exactly what they appeared to be. Pete was gruff and warm and made no pretense of either. Rodrigo was cheerful and competent and held both qualities without apology. Sam was homesick and 19 and honest about both when pressed. And Oliver Keating was quiet and steady and present in a way that asked nothing extra of anyone, no performance, no maintenance, just the plain fact of his company. She found that she looked forward to the evenings more than was perhaps wise. One evening in mid-October, Oliver came back to the house before dark, which was unusual enough that Eva looked up from the bread she was making with a question on her face. He was carrying something. A small wooden chair, obviously handmade, with a lower seat than a standard chair and a slight incline to the back, roughly the right size for a child who was not yet sitting up strongly on her own but who had developed the emphatic opinion that she should not always be on her back. He set it on the kitchen table without ceremony and said, "I thought she might use it. It's not pretty, but it should hold." Eva looked at the chair. It was, in fact, not pretty. It was clearly the work of a man who was skilled with practical tools but not particularly with decorative ones. But it was solid and well-fitted and clearly made with care and precise, repeated adjustment. She picked it up and tested it, felt the weight and balance of it. "When did you make this?" she asked. He shrugged. "Evenings. Evenings." He had been spending his evenings making a chair for a child who was not his, out of some simple recognition that the child needed one and he had the means to provide it. Eva set the chair back down very carefully because her hands had gone slightly unsteady. "Oliver," she said, and stopped. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. It was the second time she'd said it to him in that particular way, with that particular weight beneath the words, and he received it the same way he had the first time, a slight nod, a steady meeting of her eyes, an absence of deflection or false modesty. "She's a good baby," he said. "She should have a chair." That was all. He went to wash his hands at the pump, and Eva turned back to her bread dough and pressed her knuckles into it with perhaps more force than was strictly necessary, because her heart was doing something complicated, and she needed to concentrate on something physical. Clara sat in the chair at supper that night, propped with a folded blanket, watching the men eat with those wide, philosophical eyes, and Pete raised his coffee cup to her in a solemn toast, and Rodrigo taught them all the Spanish word for chair, silla, and made everyone say it 3 times until he was satisfied, and Sam said it wrong all 3 times in a way that suggested he was doing it on purpose to make Clara laugh, and she did laugh, and Oliver Keating, at the head of the table, ate his supper with the faintest smile on his face that Eva thought might be the most beautiful thing she had seen in a year. November came in hard, with a cold wind off the plains that cut like a blade, and the ranch contracted into itself the way things do in the country when winter starts to make its intentions known. The men spent more time in the barn and less time in the fields. The stove in the kitchen became the heart of the house, the place everything and everyone orbited. Eva had been at the Keating ranch for nearly 2 months, and something had shifted between her and Oliver in the way that things shift between 2 people who spend a great deal of time together without quite acknowledging the shift. Their conversations had lengthened. Not dramatically. Oliver was not a man given to lengthy speech, but where they had spoken in brief, practical exchanges at first, they now spoke at the supper table and after, sitting by the fire in the evenings while Clara slept, about things that were not purely practical. He told her about the ranch, its history. He'd bought the land 3 years ago, built the house himself with help from Rodrigo and Pete, had been running cattle since the first year with varying success and an improving education. He told her about his family, a father who had died when Oliver was 22 of a fever that had swept through the county, a mother who had gone to live with the Nebraska sister after the father passed, a younger brother who had gone to Colorado looking for silver and found a wife instead, and was currently in Denver trying to establish himself as a smith. He asked her about Missouri, about what she had loved there and what she had been glad to leave. She told him about the rivers, the particular green of Missouri summers, the church-going culture that had both sustained and suffocated, the way a town with deep roots in every family made it nearly impossible to be anyone other than who it had decided you were. "Did you always want to leave?" he asked one evening. "I always wanted something different," she said, watching the fire. "I didn't know what. I was a woman in a small town in Missouri in 1878. The options for different were not extensive, A small, wry smile. "I didn't expect to find it by way of disgrace, but here we are." He was quiet for a moment. Then carefully, like a man placing something fragile on a shelf. "Do you think of it as disgrace? Still." She considered that honestly. Clara was asleep. The fire was low and amber. Outside, the wind moved across the plains in long, cold sweeps. "No," she said. "Not anymore. I think I thought I was supposed to. But I look at her sleeping in that crate that you lined with blankets in this house that feels more like a real home than the one I grew up in, and I don't feel disgraced. I feel like I made it." Oliver looked at her steadily in the firelight, and something in his expression shifted, something that had been careful and contained moving just slightly toward openness. "You did make it," he said. They sat in silence after that, but it was the kind of silence that is not empty. The first real trouble came in November, on a Tuesday, when a man rode up to the ranch gate on a horse that was better than anything else in the county, and dismounted with the ease of someone who had never once considered that he might not be welcome wherever he arrived. His name was Gerald Marsh, and he was 43 and owned the second largest ranch in Sumner County, a man who wore his wealth in the cut of his coat, and the quality of his boots, and the particular set of his jaw that said he was accustomed to getting what he wanted with whatever degree of unpleasantness was required. Oliver was in the yard when Marsh arrived, and Eva was on the porch with Clara, having come outside for the morning air. She saw Oliver's posture change, not dramatically, but she had been watching him for 2 months, and she knew the difference between his ordinary stillness and this, the kind of stillness that is actually a readiness. Marsh looked at Eva and Clara on the porch before he said a word to Oliver. It was a slow, measuring look, and Eva disliked it intensely. "Keating," Marsh said, turning back to Oliver, "I want to talk to you about the North Pasture boundary." "We've talked about it," Oliver said. "Nothing's changed. I'm offering you fair value and then some. It's not for sale, Gerald." Marsh's eyes went back to the porch, to Eva and the baby. "I heard you had someone new out here," he said, and the tone of it, the slight emphasis, the implication threaded beneath the words, made Eva's spine go rigid. Oliver's voice stayed level, but something in it went to iron. "She's my housekeeper. Is there anything else about my property you want to discuss?" The "my" was deliberate, and they all three knew it. Marsh smiled, not pleasantly. "Just wanted a look at the situation." He pulled himself back onto his horse with that same ease. "You think on the pasture. I'm not the sort of man who stops asking." He rode away without looking back. Oliver turned toward the house, and his eyes met Eva's across the yard. She held his gaze, and he held hers, and in that brief exchange she understood that he had drawn a line deliberately and entirely, and a warmth moved through her that she could not pretend was anything as simple as gratitude. "Who is he?" she asked when Oliver came up to the porch. "A man who buys what he can't simply have and pressures what he can't buy," Oliver said. "He's been after the North Pasture for 2 years. It sits between his land and the creek access. Without it, his cattle have to go 3 miles further to water. And you won't sell." "It was the first piece I bought," Oliver said simply. "The creek access is why I could build this ranch. Without it, we'd have spent the last 3 years hauling water by barrel." He went inside then, and Eva stood on the porch a moment longer, looking at the trail of dust Marsh had left on the road south. There was a feeling in her chest, something she recognized with a start as protectiveness. She wanted to protect this ranch, this quiet, deliberate man, this life that had been offered to her with such matter-of-fact generosity. The feeling was larger than she had expected, and she stood with it for a while, feeling its weight, before she took Clara back inside. December arrived, and with it the first real snow, which fell on a Friday night and left the world transformed by morning into the kind of blinding white silence that makes the whole country feel brand new. Clara, who had never seen snow, was brought to the window by Eva, and regarded it for a long time with an expression of profound uncertainty before apparently deciding, based on some 4-month-old internal calculus, that it was acceptable. Oliver came in from the morning feeding, stamping snow from his boots, and paused in the kitchen doorway at the sight of Eva holding Clara up to the window. And the morning light came in white and particular. And Eva was laughing at something Clara had done with her hands, and the sound of that laugh in his kitchen, unguarded and completely real, did something to Oliver Keating that he had not planned on and was not entirely sure how to manage. He had told himself, when he had replied to Eva's letter, that he needed practical help and nothing more. He had told himself this quite firmly through the first weeks of her presence on his ranch, through the evenings by the fire that grew longer and the conversations that grew deeper. He had told himself this in October when he had spent 3 evenings making a chair for her daughter, and felt it was entirely reasonable. And in November when he had used the word "my" in front of Gerald Marsh and told himself it was simply geographic precision. He had been telling himself this for 2 months with decreasing conviction, and standing in his kitchen doorway in December watching Eva Morgan laugh in the morning snowlight, he understood with the clarity that only comes from finally stopping arguing with yourself that he had stopped believing it entirely. He said nothing. He went to the stove and poured his coffee, and Eva turned from the window and saw him, and something in her expression, a quick, bright, slightly startled quality, told him that whatever was happening between them was not entirely invisible to her either. Snow was thick, she said, the first practical thing she could find. 6 inches at least, he agreed, the first practical thing he could find. They sat at the breakfast table, and he drank his coffee and she ate her biscuit, and Clara sat in the little wooden chair with her painted beads, and everything was exactly as it had been every morning for 2 months, except that the air between them had changed in a way that neither of them yet knew what to do with. On a Wednesday in December, Pete came in from town with his ears red, whether from cold or from something he'd heard. Eva couldn't immediately tell, and he asked to speak with Oliver privately, which he did, and afterward Oliver came to find Eva in the kitchen with a look on his face that was carefully controlled. "Marsh is spreading talk," he said, "about you being here." Eva turned from the stove. "What kind of talk?" The kind meant to be unkind. His jaw was set. "About your circumstances, the baby. Implications about the nature of the arrangement here." Eva felt the familiar cold thread of it, the particular cruelty of small-town opinion following her across state lines, and she took a breath. "I see. I want you to know," Oliver said, and his voice was very deliberate, "that I don't give any consideration whatsoever to what Gerald Marsh or anyone under his influence says about this house, but I thought you should hear it from me before you heard it from someone else." She nodded. She was grateful for that, for the directness, for not being shielded from it condescendingly. "Has anyone in town said anything to you directly?" "Mrs. Henley asked me at the feed store whether I'd lost my senses," he said, and something in his expression suggested he found this slightly amusing despite himself. "She thinks I should have hired a married woman." "What did you say?" "I said I'd hired the most capable woman who answered my notice, and that the opinion of a woman who put a dead mouse in her husband's boot in 1876 and blamed it on his horse wasn't something I was inclined to weight heavily." He paused. "I may have been somewhat brief about it." Eva stared at him. Then she laughed. It was the same full, unguarded laugh he had heard that morning in the snowlight, and it hit him in exactly the same place. "Oliver Keating," she said, "you are occasionally remarkable." He looked at her. His coffee cup was still in his hand. The kitchen was warm and smelled of the stew she had on the back of the stove. Clara was in the other room making the particular sound she made when she was entertaining herself. "Eva," he said, and stopped. She waited. He set the coffee cup down on the table very carefully with both hands, like a man who needs something to do with his hands. "I want to say something to you, and I'm not certain I have the right. You've been here 2 months. You came here as an employee, and I don't want to say something that makes you feel that the arrangement is, that there's some expectation attached to your position here. There isn't. I want to be clear about that first." "I understand," she said, and her voice had gone quiet and careful, the way voices do when something important is happening. He looked up and met her eyes. "I think about you all the time," he said. It was plainly stated, no embellishment, no romantic flourish, just Oliver Keating speaking a true thing in the most direct manner he knew. I think about you when I'm out with the cattle, and I think about you in the evenings, and I thought about you every night I was making that chair and told myself I was just being practical. I'm not certain what to do with that except tell you, because it doesn't seem fair to you not to know. The kitchen was very quiet. Eva crossed the floor in 3 steps and stood in front of him, close enough that she had to tip her head back slightly to look up at him, and she said, "I look for you in the mornings. As soon as I'm up. I go to the window and look for you coming across from the barn, and if I see you I feel better than I did the moment before, and I've been calling it relief that you're safe, but it isn't only that." The distance between them, already small, reduced to nothing, and Oliver Keating kissed Eva Morgan for the first time in the kitchen of his ranch house, while the stew bubbled on the back of the stove and the prairie wind ran cold along the eaves. And it was nothing like the romance novels that Eva had read in Missouri as a girl described kisses. It was quieter than that and more serious, tender in the way that things are tender when they have been held carefully for a long time. He pulled back and looked at her, his hands light at her shoulders, and she looked back at him with wide eyes and a slightly wondering expression. "I have a daughter who belongs to another man," she said softly. "I know who she belongs to," Oliver said. "She belongs to you, a beat. And she belongs in this house the same as you do, if that's something you're willing to consider." Eva pressed her lips together and blinked rapidly and then said, "I am absolutely willing to consider it." He smiled then, fully, and it was different from the faint, controlled expression she had catalogued over 2 months. It lit his whole face, and Eva thought she might have put her hand on the stove by accident for how suddenly and inexplicably warm she felt. Clara called out from the other room at that moment, a demanding, cheerful vocalization that suggested she had opinions about being excluded from whatever was happening in the kitchen, and Eva laughed and Oliver let her go. And she went to get her daughter, and the kitchen smelled like stew, and the snow was still thick on the ground outside, and Oliver Keating stood at his own kitchen table feeling like a man who had been holding his breath for 2 months and had just finally let it go. Christmas at the Keating Ranch that year was the kind of Christmas that does not require ornamentation to be significant, though Eva made a reasonable effort at ornamentation anyway, cutting pine boughs from along the creek, and arranging them on the mantel with a determination that made Pete, who was watching, eventually ask whether she wanted help, and upon receiving her enthusiastic yes, found himself recruited into an operation considerably more involved than he had anticipated. Rodrigo contributed a collection of bright cloth ribbons he produced from his saddlebag with an air of modest triumph, and Sam carved, haltingly but earnestly, a small wooden star that ended up on the highest point of the pine bough arrangement, slightly lopsided but deeply sincere. Oliver watched all of this from various positions of quiet proximity. He had bought Eva a gift, a pair of good leather gloves for winter, practical, warm-lined and precisely her size, which had required 2 conversations with Mrs. Greer at the general store that had cost him more in social currency than the gloves had cost in actual money, but he had been willing to pay it. He had bought Clara a rattle made of wood and tin from the same store, and had felt, standing at the counter, a kind of uncomplicated joy about buying a Christmas gift for a baby that surprised him with its completeness. On Christmas Eve, the hands were given the day and evening, and rode into Caldwell for the celebrations there, leaving the ranch quiet. Eva made a supper that was more elaborate than their usual, and Oliver produced a bottle of wine he had been keeping, which felt like a statement of some kind when he set it on the table, and Eva accepted a glass and they ate by lamplight and talked about their respective childhoods and what Christmas had meant in their families, and discovered the particular pleasure of learning that 2 people's histories, though different, contain recognizable shapes, the same hope in the same kind of dark evenings, the same particular way that cold weather and warmth make things feel both more intimate and more fragile. After supper, Eva put Clara to bed in the crate, The baby had come through the evening cheerfully, and with the painted rattle already firmly her preferred possession, and came back to the fire, and Oliver handed her the gloves, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a piece of Rodrigo's red ribbon. She opened them and ran her thumb over the leather and looked up at him with an expression that he could not entirely name, but that made him very certain he had chosen correctly. "They're beautiful," she said. "They're exactly right. I had to ask Mrs. Greer twice about the size," he said. Eva laughed. "I imagine that conversation was an event." "It was the most thoroughly analyzed purchase in Caldwell this year, I suspect," he said, and Eva laughed again. And then she was looking at him with that direct, particular steadiness that he had come to understand was what Eva Morgan looked like when she was seeing something clearly. She reached across the small space between them and took his hand, and they stayed that way by the fire while the prairie wind moved along the eaves, and the pine boughs scented the room, and the lamp threw its amber circle around them. And the last night of that year felt, to both of them, like a kind of beginning. January was hard, as January in Kansas always is, with cold that was not cruel so much as relentless, a steady, pressing cold that demanded everything be done with extra time and care. The water in the pump froze on 3 separate mornings and had to be thawed with hot water hauled from the stove. The cattle required constant attention. Pete's hands gave him trouble in the cold, an old injury, and Eva began making a salve from lard and dried herbs that she had learned from her grandmother, which Pete received with the dignified gratitude of a man determined not to admit how much better it made things. Oliver and Eva had come to a new understanding of their days after Christmas, nothing formally declared, no promises yet spoken aloud, but an ease that was different from their earlier ease, more deliberate, more chosen. He came in from the cold in the evenings and she had coffee ready, and sometimes they sat on the same side of the table, close enough to feel each other's warmth, poring over the ranch ledgers that Eva had quietly begun to help him maintain. She had a better head for figures than he did, which he acknowledged without apparent wounded pride, and she found that she cared about the financial health of the ranch in a way that she had not expected, with a genuine investment, as if the health of this enterprise was continuous with something she was building for herself and for Clara. Clara, at 7 months, had developed the focused, determined crawl of a baby who has things to do and places to be, and the ranch house underwent a series of practical adjustments to accommodate this new mobility. Hazardous items moved to higher shelves, corners padded with folded cloth, a low gate fashioned by Oliver for the doorway between the kitchen and the back room, where the stove held its highest heat. He built it one evening without announcement and showed it to Eva in the morning, and she stood looking at it for a moment and then at him, and there was something in her eyes that was no longer surprised exactly, but still deeply moved. "You keep building things for her," she said. He looked at the gate, then at her. "She needs things built for her," he said simply. Eva stepped close to him and put her hand on his jaw and kissed him with a thoroughness that made him go still all over, and then she stepped back and went to start breakfast with the color high in her cheeks, and Oliver stood in the doorway to the kitchen feeling as if the foundations of everything had just shifted 4 inches in the most entirely welcome direction. It was February when Gerald Marsh made his second move, and this time it was not a conversation at the gate. Oliver discovered it on a Monday morning, a section of the north pasture fence cut clean through, 3 posts, the wire laid on the ground in a way that was unmistakably deliberate, not wind or animal damage. 30 head of cattle had drifted through the gap overnight into the adjacent field, which happened to border Marsh's land. 2 of those cattle were unaccounted for. Oliver came back to the house with this news, and his face was very quiet, which Eva had come to understand meant something in him was quite angry. "Can you prove it was Marsh?" Eva asked. "Not yet," Oliver said. He sat at the table and she brought him coffee without being asked, a habit that had become mutual and reflexive, and sat across from him. He'll claim it was an accident, or he'll claim he doesn't know about it and offer to pay for the missing cattle at a price that's generous enough to look innocent. And the fence? He'll deny knowing anything about it. He turned the cup. He's been doing incremental things since October. A steer that wandered onto his land and came back short an ear tag. A water trough near the border that someone broke. Small things. Eva was quiet for a moment. He wants you to sell, and he wants to make it difficult enough that you'll eventually do it just for peace. That's his way, Oliver said. What are you going to do? He looked at her directly. I'm going to repair the fence, find the cattle if I can, and file a formal complaint with the county sheriff. A pause. And I'm not going to sell. Eva nodded. Good, she said flatly, and the absolute certainty in that single word made Oliver look at her. You don't have to be involved in this, he said. It's my trouble. Eva set her coffee cup down very deliberately. Oliver Keating, she said. I keep the ledgers for this ranch. I mend your ranch hands' work gloves and make salve for Pete's hands, and I have been feeding 6 grown men and a baby in this kitchen for 3 months. I am involved in this. He looked at her for a long, still moment. Yes, he said quietly. You are. The complaint was filed, and the county sheriff, a practical man named Dalton who had seen enough of Gerald Marsh's operations to be thoroughly tired of them without yet having sufficient evidence to do much about it, registered the complaint, noted the damage, and told Oliver to keep records of everything. It was not a satisfying resolution, but it was a formal one, which had its own kind of weight. Marsh paid for the 2 missing cattle, exactly as Oliver had predicted, at a price generous enough to be insulting in its transparency. Oliver accepted the payment with a cool politeness that communicated clearly and without any direct statement that he was keeping meticulous records and was not remotely intimidated. And Marsh rode away from that exchange looking slightly less pleased with himself than he had arrived. March came in with mud and the first pale green of new grass, and with it a visit to the ranch from a woman Eva had not yet met, Oliver's mother, Eva Keating, who had come down from Nebraska to spend a month with her son. Eva Keating was 60 and spare, with white hair and the kind of direct, assessing eyes that Eva recognized as the source of her son's. She arrived on the afternoon stage from Caldwell, was collected by Oliver in the wagon, and walked into the house with a sharp, comprehensive look around that took in everything. The pine boughs dried on the mantel, the mended curtains, the organized kitchen, the wooden child's chair at the table, in the space of about 4 seconds. Then she looked at Eva. Then she looked at Clara, who was on the kitchen floor with her wooden beads and her rattle, doing what Clara did, which was examining the world with devoted philosophical attention. Well, Adeline said, setting down her bag, and there was a whole conversation in that single syllable. The first 2 days were a careful navigation, 2 women establishing the parameters of their relationship with a mutual assessment, not unlike 2 cats determining territorial boundaries, conducted through elaborate politeness. Adeline was not unkind, but she was forthright, and on the evening of the 2nd day she and Eva were alone in the kitchen while Oliver was in the barn, and Adeline said without preamble, "Tell me about the child's father." Eva set down the dish she was washing. She turned and looked at Eva Keating with a directness she had earned by February. He was the man I was engaged to marry. He chose another woman when his family offered a better arrangement. He knew about Clara and wanted nothing to do with her. She held Adeline's gaze. He is in Missouri and he will stay there. Adeline was quiet for a moment. Does Oliver know all of this? Yes. And he made her a chair, Eva said quietly. He lined her crate with blankets before I even arrived. He built a gate for the kitchen doorway when she started crawling. Her voice was steady and clear. He has never once treated her as anything other than exactly what she is. Which is what? A child who deserves to be looked after. Adeline was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He's never brought a woman into this house before. Not once, and he's been here 3 years. I want you to understand what that means." Eva understood. "I don't take that lightly," she said. Adeline looked at her for another long moment, and then something in her face settled, some final piece of assessment completing itself. "Good," she said, and turned back to the stove. And after that there was no more negotiating, only two women cooking in a kitchen together with the comfortable ease of people who have decided to trust each other. Adeline spent her evening sitting with Clara, which Clara clearly found entirely acceptable. She sang to her old songs, hymns mostly, and some others that Eva didn't recognize, in a low, tuneful voice, and Clara listened with her head tipped and her eyes serious, as if she were taking notes on the musical tradition of the Keating family for future reference. On the Friday of the second week, Adeline sat across from Oliver at the supper table after the hands had gone and Eva had taken Clara to bed, and she said to her son in a voice low enough that Eva, in the next room, could hear the murmur but not the words, something that made him very quiet and then, after a pause, made him say something back with a softness she had not quite heard in his voice before. She did not ask what was said, she did not need to. The night before Adeline left to return to Nebraska, she and Eva sat on the porch in the early spring dusk, and Adeline said, "You've made this a home." Eva looked out at the darkening fields. "He made it easy to." "He wouldn't say that," Adeline said. "No," Eva agreed. "He wouldn't." Adeline's hand found hers on the porch rail, briefly, warmly, and then she took it away and they sat in the quiet evening together. And when Oliver came out to join them a few minutes later and settled on the step below, the three of them watched the first stars appear over the flat Kansas plain, and Eva felt the particular, still happiness of a person who has found, unexpectedly, and by a route they never would have mapped for themselves, exactly where they are supposed to be. April brought planting season and the return of the full, loud, purposeful rhythm of ranch life in its spring form. Cattle tended and pasture managed and fences walked and repaired after the winter's work on them. And Eva found herself outside more, Clara in a cloth sling across her chest when necessary, walking the edges of the property with Oliver on Sunday mornings when the hands were off, learning the land in the same deliberate, patient way she had learned the house. He showed her the north pasture and the creek access, the cottonwood trees along the bank, the deep, clear run of water that had been, he told her, the single reason he had chosen this particular piece of ground from everything available in the county. He showed her where he had first put fence posts, 3 years ago, in the ground that was still cold, and she could picture it, this man 25 years old and entirely alone in the Kansas grassland, driving posts into the earth with the focused certainty of someone who has made a decision and intends to honor it. "Were you afraid?" she asked. He considered this seriously, the way he considered everything. "Not of the work," he said. "I was afraid the whole thing would prove to be less than what I'd imagined it could be." He looked out over the creek. "A man can work hard enough that he doesn't have to think too much about whether he's lonely. I was good at that." She looked at him. "And now?" He looked back at her, and his expression was open in the way it only became when they were alone on the land with no one else around. "Now I know the difference," he said, "between not thinking about it and it actually not being true." Eva shifted Clara, who was awake in the sling and watching the cottonwood branches above them, and she leaned into Oliver's side and he put his arm around her, the three of them standing at the creek bank in the April sun. And it was one of those moments that a person carries with them for the rest of their life, perfectly detailed, perfectly lit, so ordinary in its components and so absolute in its significance. On a May evening, with the prairie in full green, and the evenings warm enough to sit on the porch again in comfort, Oliver asked Eva to marry him. He did not do it with any particular fanfare. They were on the porch after supper, the hands long since gone to the bunkhouse, Clara asleep, the last of the daylight making the grass glow, and he turned to her from where he'd been leaning on the porch rail and said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever your answer is, nothing about your position here changes. That isn't why I'm asking, and I don't want you to feel that it is." Eva looked at him. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want Clara to have my name if you'll allow it, and I want to build whatever comes next here with you." Not because of anything other than that you are, he stopped, searched for the word, and found it with the careful precision that was entirely characteristic of him. You are the realest thing that has come into my life, and I love you. The last three words, spoken simply and without decoration, landed in Eva's chest like sunlight through a window. She had thought about love carefully over the preceding months, thought about what it meant, and whether she was capable of it in the way she needed to be, having once trusted her feeling of it and been wrong. She had been honest with herself in the long evenings while Clara slept and the fire burned low and Oliver was across the main room reading, being honest about the difference between needing shelter and loving a man, between gratitude and devotion. She knew the difference now. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you since December, and I have been certain of it since February, and I have been trying to find the right way to say it since March." She laughed, slightly shakily. "You beat me to it." He came off the railing and he kissed her, and she put both arms around him and held on with a completeness that expressed everything she had not said for 6 months. And the evening was warm, and the prairie smelled like new grass, and somewhere across the field, one of the horses made a soft sound, and Oliver Keating and Eva Morgan were, in that moment, entirely and irrevocably each other's. The wedding was held on the 15th of June, 1880, in Caldwell, at the small frame church that had been established in the county 3 years prior. It was not a large event. Eva wore a dress she had altered from a second-hand find in town, cream-colored muslin with blue ribbon trim, modest and exactly right, and carried a bunch of wildflowers that she and Clara had picked that morning from the field behind the house. Oliver wore his best clothes, dark trousers and a clean white shirt, and the vest that Rodrigo had told him, in a tone that admitted no disagreement, was the right choice. Pete and Rodrigo and Sam were there, cleaned up to varying degrees of success, Pete with his hat actually in his hands rather than on his head, which represented, Eva felt, a profound effort. Adeline Keating had come down from Nebraska again, arriving 2 days prior, and had spent those 2 days helping Eva prepare and pretending not to be emotional about it with only moderate success. Hank Greer, who had driven Eva out to the ranch on her very first day, was there with his father, and Mrs. Dalton, the sheriff's wife, who had taken it upon herself to befriend Eva over the winter with a directness that Eva found entirely refreshing. The minister read the words. Oliver said his with a quiet, steady certainty that made the words feel like something that had always been true and were only now being formally acknowledged. Eva said hers clearly, looking him in the eyes the whole time, meaning every syllable. Clara, held by Adeline during the ceremony, watched her mother get married with the expression of someone filing detailed information away for later consideration. When Oliver was told he could kiss his bride and did, Pete made a sound that could only be described as a suppressed cheer, which Rodrigo did not suppress at all, and Sam clapped so enthusiastically that his hat fell off, and Adeline dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief and then looked at anyone who noticed with an expression that dared them to comment. The celebration afterward was at the ranch, a long table set outside in the June evening, food that Eva and Adeline and Mrs. Dalton had been collectively preparing for 2 days spread across it in warm, generous abundance. Rodrigo produced a guitar from somewhere and played with a skill that surprised no one who had been paying attention for the past 8 months. And Pete told the same 3 stories he always told when he'd had sufficient whiskey, but told them with such conviction that they remained genuinely entertaining. Oliver danced with Eva on the grass outside the house, one hand on her waist and one holding hers, moving in the careful, deliberate way of a man who does not often dance but intends to do it right, and Eva rested her forehead against his jaw and felt the solid reality of him. This man she had arrived as a stranger to 7 months ago. This man who had built things for her daughter without being asked and who had said real before he said love because he had thought about the true shape of what he was saying. "Mrs. Keating," he said quietly near her ear. She pulled back and looked at him, and the smile on her face was the kind that starts in the eyes, deep and real. "Mr. Keating," she said. He held her closer, and they danced while the June stars appeared above the Kansas plains, and the fiddle player who had come from town joined Rodrigo's guitar, and the night was warm and full and complete. The months that followed were the months of a life being built in the most concrete, daily, particular way. Oliver registered Clara's birth formally in Sumner County with the name Clara Keating, which required a document and a notary and cost $4, which Oliver paid without the smallest hesitation, and Eva stood beside him at the county clerk's office and watched her daughter's name written in the official ledger, and felt something settle in her so deep it was structural. Gerald Marsh made one further attempt to pressure Oliver in the autumn of 1880, this time by approaching two of Oliver's cattle buyers directly with unfavorable stories about the Keating herd's quality, which was a transparently self-serving lie that was disproved within a week by any buyer who looked at the cattle themselves. Oliver filed another formal complaint, this time with sufficient documented evidence that Sheriff Dalton was able to have a very pointed conversation with Marsh that, by all accounts, left Marsh considerably less comfortable than he had been. After that, Marsh confined himself to a cold and distant antagonism that was vastly preferable to active interference, and Oliver kept his records current and his fence lines clean and let the matter rest. Eva took over full management of the ranch accounts by the winter of 1880, freeing Oliver to focus on the operational side without the desk work he found tedious, and she found genuinely interesting. She had a facility for numbers and for planning that complemented his operational instincts well, and they worked together on the quarterly assessments with a partnership that ran through their professional and personal lives without any clear dividing line between them, in the way of people who have married someone they also genuinely like. Clara learned to walk in October, at 9 months, with the determined, slightly aggressive forward lean of a baby who has calculated the angles and has decided that speed is the primary virtue. She walked from the kitchen table to Oliver's leg, which was where she always headed when she was attempting something new, using it as her reliable fixed point, and Oliver sat on the kitchen chair and watched her come across the floor at him with Clara's particular focused intensity, and he caught her at the end with both hands, holding her upright, and said, "There you are," with a warmth in his voice that ran through Eva so thoroughly it was almost dizzying. Clara's first clear word was not mama, though that came second. Her first clear, intentional, deployed word was Ollie, which was Clara's phonetic solution to a name she was not yet equipped to handle in full. Oliver looked so startled when she said it, sitting in the main room on an October afternoon with Clara in his lap and Eva across the room, that Eva laughed so hard she had to sit down, and Oliver looked between his wife and the baby on his knee with an expression of such unguarded, slightly overwhelmed happiness that it became one of Eva's most treasured mental images, preserved and polished over the following years. In January of 1881, Eva told Oliver she was expecting. She told him in the morning in the kitchen before the hands were up, and his face did a sequence of things: surprise, then comprehension, then something so full and uncontrolled that he had to press his lips together for a moment. Then he stood up from the table and crossed to her in 2 steps and held her with a care that was also a completeness, his face in her hair, and she could feel the whole length of his breathing, deep and slow and deeply glad. "Are you well?" he asked, which was the first thing he said, and it was so exactly him that she felt tears on her face without quite knowing they were coming. "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I'm wonderful." "You are," he said quietly, and held her closer. The spring of 1881 proceeded with the particular combination of the ordinary and the extraordinary that characterizes a life that is genuinely good cattle and fence lines and ledgers, and the mud of March and the green of April, and Eva's shape changing with the months, and Oliver's hand on her back in the evenings as they sat by the fire, reading or talking or simply being, and Clara Keating at 19 months, a small, purposeful person with opinions on everything and a laugh that could stop the whole kitchen. Sam received a letter from Georgia in March informing him that his mother was ill, and Oliver gave him the time off to go without any hesitation and held his job for him with a reliability that made Sam come back in May with a loyalty that was impossible to quantify but entirely visible in how he worked. Rodrigo taught Clara 3 words of Spanish: gato, which was cat; perro, which was dog; and sol, which was son. And Clara applied them comprehensively and without excessive precision to every animate object and several inanimate ones, and the whole ranch found this correct and appropriate. Pete's hands gave him serious trouble in a cold April rain, and Eva sat with him in the kitchen that evening and listened to him talk about the ranch in New Mexico where he'd been young, about the way the landscape was different there, and understood that he was getting older in a way that required acknowledgement rather than action, and she gave him more of the salve and asked him about the country down south. And he went back to the bunkhouse considerably less stiff and with the particular lightened quality of a man who has been heard. In August of 1881, Eva delivered their son. Oliver was present, as Eva had asked him to be, and had spent the labor night sitting beside her with a steady presence that cost him something visible, the white line of his jaw when she was in pain, but he never moved from where she needed him to be. And when the midwife from Caldwell, a capable woman named Mrs. Hensley who had been doing this for 30 years, placed the baby in Oliver's arms while Eva was being settled, the expression on Oliver's face was simply beyond description. The baby was named James Oliver Keating, and he arrived with a quantity of dark hair and a set of lungs that he was entirely prepared to use. And Clara, introduced to her brother the following morning, considered him for a long time from the edge of the bed, and then patted his head with a firm, proprietary hand that communicated both affection and the establishment of seniority. Oliver held James that first morning, and Eva watched him, this man who had lined a wooden crate with soft blankets for another man's child before she had even arrived, this man who had built a chair for a baby whose father had decided not to care. And she understood with the full and complete understanding of a person who has lived through the worst, and found the best that she was holding the entirety of a life that was exactly what it was supposed to be. "You are remarkable," she said, which was what she had told him once before, and he looked up and his eyes were bright in a way he made no effort to conceal. "You said that to me once before," he said. "I meant it then too," she said. The autumn of 1881 was the fullest Oliver had ever experienced, and he had thought about this, because Oliver Keating thought about things carefully, and understood that fullness was the right word, that the years before had not been empty exactly but that they had been waiting, whether he had known it or not, for the particular combination of people and purpose that made a house into something that wasn't merely a structure but a living thing. James was a robust and loud presence from the start, different in temperament from Clara's philosophical calm, more immediately expressive of every opinion. He communicated his views on food, sleep, the positioning of blankets, the proximity of adults, and the quality of any given morning with a volume and directness that Pete found hilarious, and that Rodrigo greeted each day as if it were a performance he had specifically come to see. Clara, at 2, had developed a proprietary pride in her brother that expressed itself as constant supervision. She would sit beside his crate, which had been brought out of storage and relined with fresh blankets, Oliver performing this task without comment, and Eva noticing and saying nothing because sometimes things are said more clearly in action than in words, and report to any available adult on his status. Asleep, awake, crying, not crying, looking at the ceiling, looking at me. She delivered these reports with the gravity of someone performing an important civic function. Winter came in 1881, and Eva found herself standing on the porch one December evening, the first anniversary of their engagement approaching, with James asleep inside and Clara asleep, and the ranch settled into the good quiet of a cold night, and Oliver came to stand beside her, and they looked at the same dark, star-thick sky that had been above this land all along, through everything. "I keep thinking about the day I arrived," Eva said. "With the carpet bag," Oliver said. "And Clara against my shoulder," she said. "I was so frightened. I was holding it together with both hands and I was so frightened." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "You did know, didn't you, even then?" "You had the look of someone who had decided to be brave regardless," he said. "I recognized it." She turned to face him fully. "What were you frightened of?" He was quiet a moment. "That I'd say something wrong and you'd leave before I'd worked out that I needed you to stay." Eva put her hand against his chest, over his heart, and felt it beating under her palm with the same steady rhythm she had come to know as well as her own. "I was never going to leave," she said. "I just didn't know it yet." He covered her hand with his and they stood together in the cold, the ranch around them quiet and enduring, everything built and earned and real. By the spring of 1882, the Keating Ranch had expanded by 12 head of cattle purchased from a neighbor who had decided to move his family to Colorado, and the operation had become sufficiently established that Oliver was able to hire a fourth hand, a quiet, competent man named Elias who had come up from Texas with the last trail drive and decided to winter in Caldwell, and found that wintering had turned into staying. The ranch accounts were in order, the land productive, the relationship with the county now conducted on the terms of an operation that had proven its solidity and its intention to remain. Gerald Marsh had, by the spring of 1882, focused his attentions on an ongoing dispute with a different neighbor that consumed his considerable energy, and the Keating Ranch became essentially uninteresting to him, which was the best possible outcome. Oliver noted this with a quiet satisfaction and moved on. Clara turned 2 in May and received from Oliver a small wooden horse that he had spent the winter carving in the evenings, beautifully made this time, finished and smooth, with a mane carved in careful lines. She carried it everywhere for months and named it, with Clara's characteristic directness, horse and then eventually brown horse, and then eventually, inexplicably, Margaret, and Margaret the wooden horse was present at every meal and in every corner of the house for the following years. James hit 6 months in February of 1882 and began his own determined campaign toward mobility, crawling with a single-minded aggression that suggested he intended to cover every available surface of the ranch at the earliest possible opportunity. And the gate Oliver had built for the kitchen doorway when Clara was crawling was retrieved from the corner it had been stored in and rehung without any discussion. Simply done. A quiet continuity of care. Eva found herself in the late evening sometimes, after both children were asleep and the house was quiet, sitting at the kitchen table with the ledgers open but not looking at them, just holding the stillness of the house around her, the smell of it, wood and hay and coffee, and the particular scent that was Oliver's and the children's and hers, all of it woven together into something unmistakably theirs. She had come here with nothing but a carpetbag and a baby and the determined, frightened forward motion of a woman who had run out of other options, and she had found not salvation exactly, not rescue, not the simple restoration of something taken from her, but something new and deliberate and grown from this particular ground. A man who had loved her daughter before he loved her, and who had never once made either of them feel they were contingent or conditional. A ranch that she had helped build into something real. A life that was hers in a way that the life in Missouri had never quite managed to be. She thought of Thomas Caulfield sometimes, not with the grief or the fury she had carried in the first year, but with a kind of abstracted, almost anthropological interest. A man who had looked at Eva Morgan and Clara Morgan and found them wanting. She wished him no particular ill. She had simply moved so far past the coordinates where he existed that the distance had long since become its own resolution. In the summer of 1882, Adeline Keating came for what she said was a short visit and stayed 3 months, because the Nebraska farm felt quieter than she liked, and the Keating ranch was, as she put it with characteristic brevity, considerably more alive. She and Eva had by this point moved fully past diplomacy into the comfortable, slightly combative warmth of women who respect each other and know it. They argued cheerfully about cooking and agreed entirely about Oliver, and were united in their opinion of Clara's willfulness, which was admirable and would need managing, they both said, but only theoretically, because in practice neither of them actually managed it at all, and both of them were secretly delighted by it. Oliver watched his mother and his wife sit on the porch in the summer evenings and talk and be quiet by turns, and felt the particular satisfaction of a man whose worlds have not merely coexisted but actually, genuinely merged. One October morning, nearly 3 years after Eva had stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell with her carpetbag and her daughter, Oliver found her in the kitchen before he went out to the morning work, and he stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment, Clara at the kitchen table with a biscuit and the wooden horse, James in his chair watching the morning light move across the floor with his father's steady, considering eyes, and Eva turning from the stove with 2 cups of coffee and stopping when she saw him standing there. "What?" she said, a small smile already forming. "Nothing," he said, "just looking." She walked across the kitchen and handed him his coffee, and he took it and took her hand in the same motion, and Clara looked up from her biscuit and said, with the casual authority of a 3-year-old who finds adult sentiment mildly tedious, "You always look at Mama," in a tone that suggested this was well-established and mildly excessive behavior on his part. "Yes," Oliver said, entirely without embarrassment, "I do." Eva looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup with the eyes that had been green and hollow on the stagecoach platform 3 years ago, and were now green and full of everything that 3 years of being exactly right had put there, and she said, "I look at you too," and Clara said, tolerantly, "I know," and James knocked his cup off his tray and regarded the result with scientific interest. And the morning came through the kitchen window warm and complete and entirely ordinary, in the way that the best mornings are. Ordinary because they are real, real because they were built by choice and intention, and the steady, daily decision to love what is in front of you fully and without reservation. The creek still ran along the north pasture, cold and clear. The cottonwoods were turning gold. The fence posts stood level as they had always stood, set right from the beginning by a man who had always believed the careful thing was worth the extra time. And Eva Keating, who had arrived as Eva Morgan on a Thursday afternoon in the late summer of 1879, with a carpetbag and a 4-month-old baby, and the hollow, frightened eyes of a woman who had survived something she hadn't expected to survive, stood in her kitchen in the October light of 1882 and was home, thoroughly and permanently, and for every season after home.